"Mom, have you seen the lady walking behind us? This is exactly the kind of woman I will like to get married to. She has a beautiful face, big breast, big hips, flat tummy and big YàNSH. Benson, my son, that's not the criteria for marriage. All what you mention will fade away one day." Mrs. Badmus was a woman of great strength and determination. Life had not been kind to her, yet she had never allowed hardship to break her spirit. Years ago, she had been a happy woman, living a peaceful life with her beloved husband and their 6 children, 4 boys and 2 girls. But everything changed the day tragedy struck. Her husband, the pillar of their home, was taken from her in a cruel twist of fate. A fatal car accident had snatched him away, leaving her with a heavy burden and no one to turn to. Alone, with 6 young children looking up to her for survival, she had no choice but to summon every ounce of strength within her. People in her community whispered behind her back, doubting her ability to raise so many children on her own. Some even pitied her, while others expected her to fail. But Mrs. Badmus was not a woman who gave up easily. She wiped her tears, rolled up her sleeves, and faced life head-on. She worked tirelessly, doing any job she could find, selling food at the market, washing clothes for wealthier families, and even helping out on farms when she had to. There were nights she went to bed hungry just so her children could have enough to eat. There were days she endured insults from people who looked down on her, but she swallowed her pride and kept pushing forward. Years passed, and her sacrifices began to bear fruit. One by one, her children graduated from school, and not just with any degrees, but with honors. Her eldest son became a respected medical doctor, the second an engineer, the third a brilliant lawyer. The younger ones followed in their footsteps, excelling in various professions. The once struggling widow was now the proud mother of 6 successful children. Her name became one of honor in the community. People admired her resilience, and young mothers looked up to her as a symbol of strength. She had defied all odds and turned her pain into power. But despite all her success, something troubled Mrs. Badmus deeply. She was growing old, and though her children had achieved greatness, none of them had settled down to start a family. Not a single one of them had married, and there were no grandchildren running around her home, filling it with laughter. At first, she thought it was just a matter of time. She believed they would eventually find love and bring her the joy of holding a grandchild in her arms. But as the years went by, it became clear that her children were too focused on their ambitions to think about marriage. Each time she brought up the topic, they dismissed it with a smile, assuring her that they were too busy building their careers. "Marriage can wait," they would say. "There's still so much to achieve." But how long could she wait? How long before her once lively home became nothing but an empty house filled with memories? Mrs. Badmus could feel time slipping through her fingers. She had spent her entire life working hard to give her children the best. But now, as she sat alone in her quiet house, she wondered, had she given them too much? Had she raised them to be so independent that they had forgotten the value of family? The once respected widow, now aging and alone, found herself battling a new fear. Would she leave this world without ever holding a grandchild of her own? Mrs. Badmus could no longer hide her growing concern. Time and time again, she called her 2 daughters and her first son, Benson, asking the same question. "When will you bring a suitor home?" Each time she brought up the topic, their reactions were the same. They would chuckle, exchange glances, and brush it off as though she was worrying over nothing. "Mummy, why are you in such a hurry? Marriage will come when the time is right." "Mum, I have so much on my plate right now. I can't afford any distractions." "Oh, Mother, stop worrying. I'm still young." Their laughter only deepened the worry lines on Mrs. Badmus's aging face. What they saw as a light-hearted conversation was, to her, a matter of great importance. She wasn't just talking about marriage for the sake of it. She was thinking of the future. She was growing old, and all she wanted was to see her children settled with families of their own. Her concerns reached a peak one fateful day when she received an invitation to a grand wedding. Chief Lasisi, a highly respected man in the community, was giving his daughter's hand in marriage. The event was set to be one of the most talked-about weddings of the year, attended by dignitaries and influential figures. Mrs. Badmus had known the young bride since childhood, and what troubled her most was that the girl was much younger than her own children. "How is it that this girl, whom I watched grow up, is getting married while my own children keep making excuses. That night, as she lay in bed staring at the ceiling, a thought struck her. I need to make Benson see the importance of marriage. If I don't do something now, he may never understand. A plan began to form in her mind. That same night, she reached for her phone and dialed Benson's number. The phone rang twice before he picked up. Mummy, good evening. How are you? I am fine, my son. How is work? Very well, Mummy. I just finished a long day at the hospital. Ah, my dear, you are working too hard. But that's not why I called you tonight. Oh, what is it, Mummy? Mrs. Badmus took a deep breath and spoke in the soft yet commanding tone that only mothers could master. My son, I want to ask you for a favor. Anything for you, Mummy. Just say it. I want you to come pick me up on Saturday. I have a very important wedding to attend. Chief Lassisi's daughter is getting married. I am one of the dignitaries, and I want you by my side. There was a brief silence on the other end. Benson was slightly surprised by the request. Mummy, you want me to take you to a wedding? Yes, my son. It is very important to me. Benson, unaware of the trap his mother was setting for him, smiled and agreed. No problem, Mummy. I will be there. Good. Thank you, my son. God bless you. As she ended the call, a knowing smile crept onto Mrs. Badmus's lips. Let's see how you will escape this one, Benson. She had set the stage. At that wedding, she would make sure Benson saw, with his own eyes, why it was time for him to think about marriage. Little did he know, this was just the beginning of his mother's well-crafted plan. The much-anticipated Saturday finally arrived. As promised, Benson showed up at his mother's house right on time. He stepped out of his sleek black SUV, the polished surface gleaming under the bright morning sun. Dressed in a well-tailored suit, he looked every bit the successful young doctor that he was. Mrs. Badmus, adorned in a richly embroidered lace gown, beamed with pride as she walked toward the car. She had carefully chosen her outfit for the occasion, not only because she was an honored guest, but because she wanted to present herself as the dignified and respectable woman that she was. Benson walked around to open the door for his mother, helping her into the passenger seat before settling into the driver's seat himself. The engine purred to life, and soon they were on their way to Chief Lassisi's grand wedding. The venue was breathtaking. A massive event hall stood proudly before them, decorated with colorful banners and lavish floral arrangements. Luxury cars lined the parking lot, a clear sign of the high-profile guests in attendance. As Benson parked the car, he couldn't help but notice the grandeur of the occasion. The atmosphere was lively, music played in the background, guests in regal attire strolled in gracefully, and photographers clicked away, capturing the elegance of the day. He stepped out of the car and quickly walked over to his mother's side, offering his arm as they made their way toward the entrance of the hall. As they walked, someone caught Benson's attention. A strikingly beautiful woman walked a few steps behind them. She was tall, with a graceful stride that commanded attention. Her deep brown skin glowed under the sunlight, and her curves were accentuated by the elegant, figure-hugging dress she wore. The way she carried herself, with confidence and poise, left an undeniable impression. Benson found himself slowing his pace, stealing glances at her. Mrs. Badmus, being the observant mother that she was, quickly noticed his distraction. She turned to him with a knowing smile. Benson, what are you looking at? She asked, a hint of amusement in her voice. Benson, unable to hide his admiration, sighed and turned to his mother. Mummy, that lady, she has all the qualities I'm looking for in a woman. Mrs. Badmus followed his gaze and took a brief look at the lady in question. She smiled softly, then turned back to her son. My son, she began gently, I understand that you are attracted to her beauty, but let me give you some advice. Beauty alone is not enough to build a lasting marriage. Benson frowned slightly, surprised by his mother's response. Why, Mom? He asked, intrigued. A beautiful woman like her would make me so happy. His mother placed a hand on his arm, her expression serious but warm. My son, a woman can be beautiful in the eyes of many, but true beauty, the kind that lasts, is in her heart and character. Look for a woman who will respect you, who will stand by you in difficult times, and who will support your dreams. Benson pondered her words, but his eyes drifted once again to the lady. But Mummy, he insisted, what if she's beautiful and also has a good character? Wouldn't that be the best of both worlds? Mrs. Badmus chuckled softly, an amused yet wise smile on her lips. Of course, my son. But remember, the ideal woman is not necessarily the one who turns every head in the room. It is the one who is devoted to you, who will uplift you, and who will bring you peace. Appearances fade with time, but a good heart remains forever. Benson sighed, absorbing his mother's words. I think I understand, Mom. Thanks for your advice. I'll think more carefully before choosing. Mrs. Badmus smiled and placed a gentle hand on his shoulder. Take your time, my son. True love is often found where you least expect it. And above all, choose the one who will make you a better man. Benson nodded thoughtfully. For the first time in a long while, he truly considered what his mother was saying. Little did he know, fate had already set things in motion, and this wedding would change his life forever. From that day forward, something shifted in Mrs. Badmus's heart. She had spent years worrying, praying, and even trying to push her children toward marriage. But as she watched Benson's reaction to the beautiful lady at the wedding, she realized something. She could no longer force them. Marriage was not just about finding someone attractive or checking off a list of qualities. It was a lifelong commitment, and each of her children needed to find their path on their own. With a silent prayer in her heart, she decided to step back. However, Benson was already on a different path. During the wedding reception, as laughter and music filled the hall, Benson discreetly scanned the room until his eyes found her again, the beautiful woman who had captured his attention. Her name was Bucky. She was the daughter of a respected chief, a princess in her own right. As Benson approached her, his heart pounded slightly, but he masked his nervousness with his usual confidence. He struck up a conversation, and to his delight, Bucky was charming, witty, and pleasant to talk to. They exchanged numbers, and from that moment, Benson became completely drawn to her. He wasted no time. Ignoring the cautious words of his mother, he pursued Bucky with full determination. To him, she was everything he had ever wanted, beautiful, graceful, and from a prestigious background. Within weeks, they were inseparable. Benson convinced himself that she was not only beautiful, but also a woman of great character. He had studied her, he told himself, and he was certain she was the one. One evening, he rushed home to share his excitement with his mother. Mummy, I have something to tell you, he said, barely able to contain his excitement. Mrs. Badmus, who had been quietly knitting in her chair, looked up and smiled. What is it, my son? Benson sat beside her, his face glowing with enthusiasm. I've been observing Bucky, and I can tell she's a good woman with a kind heart. She's respectful, loving, and everything I want in a wife. I've made up my mind. I'm going to marry her. Mrs. Badmus smiled, but deep inside, her heart was heavy. Something in her motherly instincts told her that her son was rushing into this. She could see the excitement in his eyes, but she could also see the blindness. He was so enchanted by Bucky's beauty that he was unwilling to look deeper. But what could she say? She had already decided not to interfere in her children's marital choices. So, she faked her happiness. Oh, my son, if she makes you happy, then who am I to stand in your way? She said, forcing a smile. Benson hugged her tightly. Thank you, Mummy. You'll see, she's the best decision I've ever made. Mrs. Badmus patted his back, but as she held him, she whispered a silent prayer. God, if this is not the right woman for my son, please reveal it before it's too late. But fate had other plans. Within months, Benson and Bucky had a grand wedding. The ceremony was extravagant, attended by dignitaries, family, and well-wishers. It was a day of celebration, and Benson believed he had won the jackpot. However, it did not take long for the cracks to appear. At first, they were small, almost invisible. Bucky, who had once seemed so graceful and elegant, began to change. She became lazy. She would wake up late, leaving the house in disarray. Plates piled up in the kitchen, and laundry was left undone for days. She never showed interest in cooking or taking care of their home, something that deeply disappointed Benson. She became careless. Expensive jewelry and clothes were scattered all over the house. Sometimes, she would order unnecessary things online, spending huge sums of money without thinking twice. And then came the worst part. She started drinking. At first, It was just a glass of wine during dinner. Then it became two. Before long, she was drinking heavily, sometimes staying out late and returning home in a drunken state. She was no longer the Bucky Benson had fallen in love with. She had become a thorn in his life. What had once been a blissful marriage quickly turned into a nightmare. Benson found himself constantly frustrated, coming home to a wife who no longer cared about him, their home, or even herself. The love he once felt was now mixed with regret. Mrs. Badmus watched everything unfold in silence. She had seen it coming, but she had hoped, prayed, that she was wrong. But now, the truth was staring her son in the face.